For the female reproductive physiology, we have two cycles happening at two different places and for two different reasons. We have the ovarian cycle. Ovarian cycle is the changes happening in the ovaries in order to release the oocyte or the egg. And then we have the uterine cycle, sometimes we call it the menstrual cycle. Those are changes happening in the uterus in order to prepare for the oocyte, especially if the oocyte is fertilized. Okay, so two different cycles at two different places, but both of them are happening at the same time. So we are dealing on 28 days of either each one of those cycles. And we will see there is a significant overlap between them in terms of processes, what's happening in each cycle. So for the ovarian cycle, as we said, we have the ovary. In the ovary, we have the follicles, right? Those follicles are the containers. Think of them, those are the containers of the eggs. So once we have the egg to develop, we need also to develop the follicle. So for the ovarian cycle, out of the 28 days, we have, this is day 1, day 28, and day 14 is in the middle. The first 14 days, we'll call them the follicular phase. Then after the day 14, we will have something called luteal phase. And in between, at day 14, we'll have ovulation. So this is the ovarian cycle. We have the follicular phase, then ovulation, and then we have the luteal phase. And we'll talk about each one of them. For the follicular phase, we said we have the follicle contains the egg. So we need to develop, the egg is going to develop. But if the egg is need to develop, its container also need to develop. So in the follicular phase, we have two processes happening at the same time. We have follicular development and we have egg development. Those two processes happening simultaneously at the same time from day 1 to day 14. Okay, so for the follicular development, we'll call it the folliculogenesis. That's the growth and development of the ovarian follicles. And for the egg development, we'll call it the oogenesis. That is the production of the female gametes. So two processes happening at the same time. Again, we need to develop the egg in order to get ready for its release. But in order to do this, not only the egg need to be developed, but also its carrier. Okay? So now for the oogenesis, the process of developing the eggs, we need to understand that during fetal development, okay, before birth, what's happening in the ovaries, that we have a mother cell of those eggs. Those mother cells will go into mitosis and they will give us the primary oocytes. Those primary oocytes still complete cells. They have the full set of chromosomes. After that, after birth, this process will cease and it will remain quiet until puberty. Okay, at puberty, every month, several of those primary oocytes kind of will wake up and continue their journey. What do? They undergo division. They will go through meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2 to produce a mature egg. So the primary oocyte will develop into secondary oocyte, okay? And this secondary oocyte is the one that, if there is sperm around, it will continue through another meiosis and it will give us the mature ovum. That is the one that will get fertilized. So that is the process of the oogenesis. What you need to understand that we have two steps before birth and after puberty. Before birth, we have the primary oocytes. Those are still carrying the 23 pairs of chromosomes. After puberty, those will develop into secondary oocyte, and in case there is fertilization, they will develop into the mature ovum. And the secondary oocyte already is having its half of the genetic material, because if you remember, the other half is coming from the sperms. So the fertilized egg will get into the 2N or the 46 chromosomes or the 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, so this is the oogenesis. Then let's talk about the folliculogenesis, which is, we said, the development of the follicle. So before birth or at birth, those eggs would remain in something called the primordial follicle. Those are underdeveloped or undeveloped follicles. But each month, 6 or 7 of those follicles, or each uterine cycle, 6 or 7 of those follicles will wake up and move and become a primary follicle. What is a primary follicle? It's a follicle that has one layer of cells, supporting cells, and the egg is inside. Those are still small in size. Then, out of the 6 or 7 follicles, we might have 4 or 5 here. primary follicles, and out of them, maybe 3 to 2 or 2 to 3 will develop into secondary follicle. What is secondary follicle? Secondary follicle is when we have 2 layers of those supporting cells. The egg is still there. The egg is doing what we were describing earlier. And this secondary follicle, some of those, maybe 1 or 2, will develop into a tertiary follicle. Tertiary follicle is a follicle that has a space. Now we have an antrum. This is a space. This space usually filled with the fluid that contains enzymes and sugars that to support the cell. And from this tertiary follicle, usually every month we will have just one ovulating follicle. Ovulating follicle, it means that this is the follicle that will release its egg. This egg will be captured by the uterine tube and it will move to the uterus. So in case there is fertilization, this is the one that will become a baby. So all of this is happening during the follicular phase. Once we have the ovulation, that is the switch from the follicular phase into the luteal phase, which we will talk about. Now the thing is that each month we said we will have several follicles, but we will end up with just one ovulating follicle. Why? Because the primary follicles, think of them like 6 or 7, will start a race and they will get bigger. Those are producing estrogen. Those estrogen will target the other follicles. So we will have usually a dominant follicle that's producing more estrogen or most of the estrogen, and it will target the other follicle, trying to eliminate them. Okay, so we'll always lose the number of follicles, but we'll get bigger follicles, stronger follicles, until there is one. This is the one that would release its egg. Okay, so ovulation usually will have just one egg. Very rarely that we will have 2 eggs from either each one of the ovaries or 2 follicles at the same time developed in one ovary. And that is if there is fertilization, that's when we will have fraternal twins. Those are the, sometimes they call them the fake twins. Now, after ovulation, we said we will have the luteal phase. What is the luteal phase? The luteal phase refers to the remaining of the follicle. So this is the ruptured follicle. It remains inside the ovary. It remains within the ovary. It doesn't go with the egg, and it will turn into something called corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is responsible for producing mainly progesterone. Mainly it produces progesterone. Also it will produce estrogen. Okay, both hormones are important for maintaining pregnancy. Both hormones are important for maintaining pregnancy. And corpus luteum, in case of a pregnancy, if there is pregnancy, it will continue producing those hormones up to 12 weeks in case of pregnancy. In case there is no pregnancy, it will atrophize within 15 days. It will die within 15 days by the end of the ovarian cycle. So the corpus luteum, again, it is the leftover of the follicle after it's released its egg. It's critical, it's important because it will start to produce hormones. Those hormones are important in maintaining a pregnancy. So if there is a fertilization, the corpus luteum will keep secreting those hormones up to 12 weeks. After that, the placenta will take this role, but if there is no pregnancy, it will die after 15 days. Let's talk now about the uterine cycle. For the uterine cycle, we have 3 phases. We have the meniscus, we have the proliferative phase, and we have the secretory phase. We'll skip the meniscus for now. Let's talk about the proliferative phase. What's happening here is that, remember in the uterine wall, we said we have the endometrium, the 2 layer, the functional and the basal layer. So what's happening in the proliferative phase is we are increasing the thickness of the functional layer. So we will have like kind of a lining of the functional layer. We have blood vessels, we will have glands filling up this, functional layer. This is the basal layer, you can think of it, and this is the functional layer. So during the proliferative phase, we will have increase in the thickness of the lining of the uterus. This is before ovulation. Ovulation is here in the uterine cycle. Once we have ovulation, we'll turn into the secretory phase. Secretory phase, there is a little increase in the thickness, but there is more blood vessels and more glands. So we'll increase the density of the blood vessels and the glands. Why? Because now there is a chance that we will have fertilized egg, and this fertilized egg will attach itself to this functional layer. So here it's responsible later, if the egg attaches itself to here, this will turn into the placenta, which is extremely important in sustaining the baby. So we need to get the entire lining of the uterus into the same thickness, into the same density of blood vessels, okay, in preparation for that fertilized egg. Now, if there is no pregnancy, then there is no need to maintain this thickness. That is when we will start to lose it. And it will come out as meniscus. So the meniscus is the shedding of the lining of the uterus. The shedding of the lining of the uterus. That will come in forms of menstruation. And that is, this meniscus is the lining of the previous cycle. And we will start a new cycle by the first day of the menstruation. Okay, so those are the 3 phases of the uterine cycle. Now, if we want to overlap the uterine cycle with the ovarian cycle, we will get into this graph. So here we have the uterine ovarian cycle, follicular phase, luteal phase, ovulation, corpus luteum, as if there is no fertilization, if there is no pregnancy, it will atrophize, it will die eventually. But the point is that we have corpus luteum. This is the uterine cycle, meniscus, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. So this is how they will overlap. Ovulation is the transition mark. Now, for the hormones, the roles of the hormones, we have 4 hormones: FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. Each one is performing and targeting different structures and coming from different structures or different glands as well. We know FSH and LH those are pituitary hormones. So those are coming from the pituitary gland and they will target the ovaries. The FSH, from its name, it's follicle stimulating hormone. So it will stimulate, it's the upper line, it will stimulate the follicular development. So we'll see it high in the follicular phase, follicle stimulating hormone. Whereas LH, the LH is extremely important in ovulation. It's the one responsible for the ovulation, LH. So we'll see it peak only just before ovulation. So usually women, when they need to know if there is, ovulation or not, one of the tests that they will perform is the levels of the LH. And those levels will not 100% tell you that there is ovulation. LH is, test will tell you that the LH is secreted at a good level to induce ovulation. So once we have ovulation, then we don't need much of the LH, we don't need much of the FSH, and they will go both, to a very minimum level. So FSH and LH are produced from the pituitary hormones targeting the ovaries, performing different functions. Then we have estrogen and progesterone. Those are coming from the ovaries. The estrogen and progesterone are coming from the ovaries. Estrogen is high during the proliferative phase. So estrogen is the one responsible for the proliferative phase. Okay, estrogen is responsible for the proliferative phase, building up the thickness of the uterus. After ovulation, and by the way, estrogen is coming from where? It's coming from those developing follicles. Remember earlier when we talked about like 6 or 7 follicles, we will end up with 1 follicle. We said the dominant follicle is secreting estrogen, mainly to inhibit those developing follicles. So we will have only one egg. Thus, estrogen also will affect the lining of the uterus, and we will have the proliferative phase. After ovulation, we will see a drop in the estrogen, and we will start to see increase in the progesterone. Progesterone is also coming from the ovaries, but from where in the ovaries? It's coming from the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is the one giving me progesterone. Also, it gives me estrogen. That's why you see increase also in the estrogen levels here. But what do they do? Estrogen and progesterone, mainly progesterone here, it is targeting the secretory phase. So progesterone is responsible for maintains the lining of the uterus. The progesterone is responsible for maintaining this thickness of the uterus, so the fertilized egg can develop safely. Very similar to the estrogen. Estrogen also is responsible for maintaining that levels of the lining. Same thing for the estrogen. Estrogen is also responsible for maintaining the lining of the uterus, but not as important as progesterone. Now, if there is no pregnancy, we said the corpus luteum will die. Therefore, we will have a drop in both levels of estrogen and progesterone, and that's when we will have the meniscus. So the meniscus, we have it because there is no progesterone and estrogen anymore. So that is what's going to happen if we overlap the ovarian and uterine cycle and see the roles of the hormones. You need to be very familiar with the roles of those hormones. Where are they coming from? What do they do? Their targets, the several factors they are affecting. So all of this you need to be familiar with. Estrogen also, if we need to add a little bit details about estrogen and progesterone, estrogen will activate in general the reproductive tract. So it will build the reproductive tract. We said that is going to help in the lining. It will induce the secondary sex characteristics, which include the growth of the breast, increasing the fat deposition in the hips and in the breasts. Also, it will widen and lighten the pelvis, especially during pregnancy, to accommodate the baby growing in size. Whereas progesterone, it will establish, we said it's going to maintain the secretory or the lining of the uterus during the secretory phase. Progesterone will prevent the development of another ovarian cycle. That is why if we have a pregnant woman, there is no more ovarian cycles, because progesterone levels are high, estrogen levels are also high. That will prevent the development of another egg. And even in old days, for breastfeeding women, usually if they are breastfeeding, their estrogen and progesterone levels are high. This will prevent another cycle, another ovarian cycle. So in old days, they used to say, like, if you are breastfeeding, you will not get pregnant. But not anymore. Now, because of the hormones in the food and so on, those hormones are mixed up, okay? And the body would receive, mixed messages because of the hormones in the food. But in old days, this was like a natural way in order not to get a second pregnancy by keeping just the breastfeeding. Progesterone also, it will reduce the contraction in the uterus. Also, it will help in preparing the breast for lactation. So the breast development would be the breast development or the breast size will become bigger during pregnancy and toward the end of the pregnancy because of the effects of the progesterone. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. Let me know if you have any questions.